The most admired shape in British motoring was never meant to be seen. Two engineers bolted flat panels over the machinery just to test it. Scrap, once they were done. Management binned the professional stylist's drawings and said, "Keep it." Within a couple of years, that accident stood in the Louvre. A few rooms from the Mona Lisa. A farm truck with rubber floors you were meant to hose out. But this isn't a happy accident. Britain invented the luxury SUV, then spent a decade milking it to prop up cars nobody wanted. And the man who built it lived to despise what you see on the school run. This is how it happened, and why he hated it. Start with the part nobody tells you. Britain had this idea first, and couldn't make it work for 20 years. The Land Rover arrived in 1948, and was an instant, world-conquering success. A tool, built for farms and armies and places without roads. But almost immediately, Rover got nervous. What if the novelty wore off? What if the world didn't want a stripped-out workhorse forever? So in 1949, they tried something softer, an 80-inch station wagon, bodied by the coach builders Tickford, a Land Rover with manners. Too expensive. A few hundred sold. It died. 2 years later, they tried again, and this attempt should stop you in your tracks. The Road Rover, a high-riding estate car, long travel suspension, some off-road ability, built on a saloon's underpinnings. Read that again. A tall estate with rough road capability, based on a road car. That is the recipe for every crossover on your street, right now. Rover sketched it in 1951. They couldn't sell that either. It drifted through the 50s, redesigned, rescheduled, never quite launched. Between 1958 and 1966, almost nothing happened at all. Britain had the future in its hands, and put it down. It took an insult from 4,000 miles away to make them pick it back up. The insult came from America, and it arrived in two parts. The first was the market itself. In 1963, Jeep launched the Wagoneer. In 1966, Ford launched the Bronco. Not farm tools, big, comfortable, family-sized off-roaders with the manners of an estate car. Dirt track on Saturday, decent house on Sunday. Americans were buying them in numbers, which meant, humiliatingly, that the Americans were now selling the exact car Rover had failed to build twice. The Road Rover's market existed after all. Someone else had gone and taken it. Rover had a researcher named Bannock studying what was happening across the Atlantic, and his reports said the same thing in every paragraph. This is real, this is growing, you are missing it. Then came the second part, less a report than a slap. The head of Rover's American operation took an ordinary Series 2 Land Rover, dropped in a light, powerful all-aluminium V8, an engine of Buick origin that Rover had bought the rights to, and shipped the thing back to Britain. No memo could have said it more clearly. Here is what people want. You already own the engine. Build it. Rover finally listened, and the man who picked up the idea was not a stylist, not a marketing man, and not remotely interested in luxury. His name was Charles Spencer King. Everyone called him Spen. He'd left school in 1942 and been apprenticed to Rolls-Royce. When he joined Rover in 1945, the firm was run by his uncles, Maurice and Spencer Wilkes, the men who created the Land Rover itself. So the blood was right. But what King actually worked on tells you far more about him than his surname does. Jet engines. His first job at Rover was the gas turbine cars, Jet 1, and the prototypes that followed. Rover genuinely believed, in the early 50s, that the family car might one day run on a turbine. King spent his youth on that. Before he ever thought about mud, he was working at the bleeding edge of what a car could be. By 1959, he was chief engineer of new vehicle projects. And when he turned to this problem, his brief was almost aggressively unglamorous. In his own words, combine the comfort and on-road ability of a Rover saloon with the off-road ability of a Land Rover. Nobody was doing it. That's it. No talk of luxury, no talk of status. One stubborn engineering question: why should you have to choose? And the answer came from his commute. Part of the Solihull factory site was being redeveloped, which meant that for weeks, King was driving across rough, broken scrubland just to get to work. Every day. And in the middle of that punishment, he worked out what the new car needed. Permanent four-wheel drive. Not switchable. Always on. He wasn't theorizing in an office. He was being shaken to bits on the way to it. The car would be coil-sprung all round, long travel suspension for comfort on tarmac, and grip off it, and the first in the world offered with permanent four-wheel drive. What it would not have, at any point in the plan, was beauty. And that's where the accident happened. Here is the moment this entire story turns on, and almost nobody knows it. King and Gordon Bashford needed something to cover the mechanicals. You cannot test a car that's just an engine, a chassis and four wheels, so the two engineers knocked a body up themselves. Simple aluminium panels bolted to a steel skeleton, flat surfaces, straight edges. No curves, because curves are difficult, and this was temporary. It existed to be thrown away. Meanwhile, the actual professional, Rover's respected styling chief, David Bash, whose entire job was making cars look good, was working on drawings for the real body. Then management walked in and looked at what the engineers had bolted together. They stopped, and they told Bash to put his drawings away. His role now was to refine what the two engineers had already made. Not replace it, tidy it, sit with that. The most celebrated shape in British motoring, the clamshell bonnet, the floating roof, that upright, honest stance every luxury SUV on earth has imitated for 50 years, was a placeholder. It was the box the real design was supposed to arrive in, and it was beautiful, precisely because nobody was trying to make it beautiful. No styling, no fashion, no attempt to impress. It looked that way because that was the simplest possible way to cover the mechanical parts, and it turned out, to everyone's astonishment, that honesty has a shape. The engineers had accidentally out-designed the designer, and now Rover had to hide it from the world, because there was a problem. Rover needed to test these things on public roads, for years, in front of journalists and rivals and anyone with eyes, so they lied, elaborately. Rover registered a company in London, a real, paperwork-filed company that existed for one purpose, to own cars. They called it Velar, from the Italian velare, meaning to veil. The joke was hiding in plain sight, and nobody got it. The test cars wore Velar badges. They were registered as Velars on the paperwork. As far as the world knew, they were prototypes from some obscure firm going nowhere. And here's the detail that makes it perfect. The badge was cheap to make, because every letter in Velar already existed in the words Land Rover. They spelled their own lie out of their own name. Roughly 24 went out. Sources disagree on the exact count, and I'd rather tell you that than pretend to a number I can't stand behind. They were hammered in Wales, tested in the heat of Spain, run across Europe and North Africa. Journalists saw them. Competitors saw them. Nobody worked it out. Not one. On the 17th of June 1970, Rover pulled the veil off in Cornwall, handing the press the keys and pointing them at the disused tin mines nearby, because the whole argument of this car was that it could do both, and they weren't going to just say so. They called it the Range Rover. Aluminium V8, permanent four-wheel drive, disc brakes all round, and that accidental body. And inside, almost nothing. Vinyl seats that didn't recline, plastic floor coverings, chosen so a farmer could hose the cabin out after a day in the fields. Chunky handles, steel wheels, no wood, no leather, no carpet, nothing you'd recognize today as luxury, because luxury was never the point. The interior was designed to be cleaned, not admired. Then, within a couple of years, came the moment that turned a Midlands farm truck into something else. The Musée du Louvre, home of the Mona Lisa, the most self-regarding art institution on the planet, put a Range Rover inside its walls and called it an exemplary work of industrial design. The French art establishment had just declared a hose-out British field vehicle to be art. The engineers who'd bolted those panels on as scrap must have wondered if someone was having them on. But the Louvre wasn't what changed the Range Rover forever. That was already happening, quietly, in the order books, because the wrong people were buying it. Within months of launch, the royal family had taken delivery. The Queen took a white one on a state visit to Zambia in 1970. before most of Britain had seen one in a showroom. Behind the royals came a class of buyer Rover never designed for. Not farmers, not the army, landowners, country estates. People who needed to tow a horsebox down a muddy lane in the morning and park outside a good restaurant that evening, and who had, until this moment, been forced to own 2 vehicles to do it. The Range Rover did both. Nothing else on earth did. And so it became, entirely by accident, a signal. Not of what you did for a living, of who you were. Demand ran miles ahead of supply. And here's the thing about desire. Once it takes hold of an object, the maker doesn't own that object anymore. Rover had built an honest tool and released it into a world that decided, without asking, that it was jewelry. You can see the whole future in that first decade. Carpet arrived, then power steering, then better trim, automatic gearboxes, leather, wood, a limited edition named after a fashion magazine that sold out instantly and became a permanent trim level. Step by step, the hose-out farm truck was dragged up market by its own buyers. Rover wasn't leading. Rover was being pulled, and you'd think a company with the most sought-after vehicle in Britain would have run with it. Instead, something worse happened, because Rover no longer controlled its own future. In 1966, it had been swallowed by British Leyland, the vast, chaotic conglomerate that gathered nearly every British car maker under one collapsing roof. In 1975, British Leyland was nationalised. The state now owned Britain's car industry, and the car industry was drowning. Here's what that meant for the Range Rover, and it's the part that should make you angry. The Range Rover was one of the few things British Leyland had that the world genuinely wanted, so its profits were used to subsidise the mediocre saloons nobody wanted. The one car that was winning quietly funded the ones that were losing, and the Range Rover itself got nothing. Essentially no new development between the mid-70s and 1980. 5 years standing still, while sitting on the most influential idea in the industry. Then, the detail that says everything. Buyers had asked for a 4-door version almost from day one. It is, in engineering terms, 2 more doors. It took British Leyland 11 years. Specialist firms outside the factory were doing the conversion themselves, because Britain's own nationalised car industry couldn't be moved to do it. That's the tragedy underneath the triumph. It was never that Britain couldn't invent the future. Britain invented it in Solihull, by accident, then spent a decade too broke and too badly run to build it properly. The rest of the world was watching, though, and they were not going to make the same mistake. Look at what came next, because the scoreboard is brutal. Porsche built the Cayenne, BMW built the X5, Mercedes built the M-Class, Bentley built the Bentayga, Lamborghini built the Urus. Every prestige manufacturer on the planet arrived at the same conclusion. Build a tall, capable, luxurious thing people will pay a fortune for. Every one of them chasing a Formula 2 engineers stumbled into in the West Midlands while trying to build a better farm vehicle. The Range Rover became, and remains, one of Britain's most valuable export vehicles. The original stayed in production more than a quarter of a century and sold over 300,000. Britain had invented an entire category of car. Every luxury maker on earth now lives inside it. There was only one person who wasn't celebrating. Spen King watched all of it, and by the end, he couldn't stand what he'd made. In 2004, more than 30 years after his accident went on sale, he said it plainly. The 4x4 was never intended as a status symbol, but later incarnations of his design seemed to be intended for that purpose. He said the people who used it that way were, in his words, deeply unattractive. He said it had become an alternative to a Mercedes, for the pompous and self-important. And he said that using one for the school run, or in a town at all, was completely stupid. Read that again, and understand what it actually is. That is a man looking at the most successful thing he ever did, and telling the world it has been ruined. He wasn't being difficult. He was being consistent. He had never designed a status symbol. He had asked one honest question: why should you have to choose between comfort and capability? And answered it as plainly as he knew how. The shape was an accident. The luxury was somebody else's idea. The pomposity was never in the plan. Spen King died in June 2010, aged 85. Gordon Bashford, who bolted those panels on with him, is gone. So is David Bash, the stylist they accidentally outdesigned. And here's what actually died with them. Not the idea is everywhere, in every school-run car park in Britain, in Porsche showrooms, in Lamborghini's order books. What died was the purpose. They built a tool so good and so honest that the world mistook it for jewelry. Britain invented the luxury SUV by trying to build a better farm truck, and then lost the thing to the very people it was never meant for. The accident survived. The point of it didn't. That's the real story of the Range Rover. Not that Britain got lucky, that Britain got it exactly right, once, by accident, and never quite got to keep it.